People often ask me, how does one write a PhD, or how does one write at all, a book or anything? And it's something that has interested me for a long time, because I've written many different things in my life. And as I come towards the end of my teaching life in this university at Cambridge, it seems a good idea to get one or two thoughts down, because I did a DPhil in history at Oxford many years ago, and then I did a second PhD, and then I did a master's degree. So I've written 3 fairly long dissertations in my life, and I've also published about 17 books and a number of articles. So I've had to think about both PhD writing and ordinary writing in order to try and practice this craft. And also I've supervised something like 30 to 40 PhD students in my time in Cambridge, examined many PhDs at other universities, and taught something like 40 master's students who do dissertations. So I've seen a very wide range of PhDs, but obviously mainly in history and anthropology and sociology and the social sciences. So that's my background and my qualifications for talking to the camera about this subject. And my friend and student Jarling is going to ask me 1 or 2 questions that she would like answered, and then I'll add a few further thoughts. Okay, Jarling.
Okay. So people usually say a good beginning is half done. How to start writing up a PhD in an efficient way? And what is a preferable structure of a good PhD?
Well, how you start writing and what is a preferable structure are 2 separate questions. The starting writing is very important, and in the sense that you shouldn't delay for too long. A lot of people get into a trap whereby they put off writing. Even when you're doing a subject such as history, it's a good idea to start writing almost straight away. Certainly when you're doing something like anthropology with fieldwork, it's a good idea to start the writing in the field before you come back. Indeed, even your preparation before you go to do your fieldwork in your first term is the beginning of the writing. The writing shouldn't be broken off. There's a misconception that fieldwork and PhDs are in 3 stages. There's preparing, there is gathering data, and then there's writing up, as if it was like archaeology, writing up a field report on our field site. But actually in most of the social sciences, the writing and the thinking and the research are all mixed together. So the more you can do writing all the time, a little bit of writing all the time, then the easier it is. Otherwise what tends to happen is that you gather masses of information, and then you don't know where to start. It seems impossible, and you get blocked. And I've had a few students who have spent the first 6 months not writing anything at all because they've got too much information. So that's to do with how you start it. The ideal shape, different universities have different lengths of PhD. Cambridge has quite a short 80,000 word limit in the social sciences. Oxford used to have 100,000, and many universities have no limit. Supposing you had 80,000, as I'm used to supervising, then of course it will depend on the subject and so on, but roughly it makes sense to think in terms of either, say, 8 chapters of 10,000 words, or say 10 chapters. You might have 10 shorter chapters, the introduction a little shorter, the conclusion a little shorter. One thing perhaps to avoid is making a chapter too long. Human beings seem to be used to reading about 10,000 words and then having a pause. If you make overlong chapters, unless there are very strong divisions within them, people don't really know when to stop, and they get a bit worn out. So all my books tend to have between 8,000 and 12,000 words. If I go over 12,000 words on a chapter, I begin to try and cut it down and divide it. So that's the sort of length and the sort of structure that I would recommend.
Okay, sounds great. And where to start then? Like some people suggest starting from introduction and then to the first chapter, the second chapter, all the way to conclusion. And some others would suggest starting from any of the chapters and not going back to the introduction until finishing all the chapters. As an experienced author of 20 books, what would be your suggestions?
Well, there are two main suggestions. One is you should never write the introduction first. I mean, it may not do any harm to write a bit of an introduction for yourself, but it certainly won't be the introduction that you use in the final dissertation, because the introduction, it's a sort of trick. You can't introduce something until you know what it is you're introducing. So it's only right at the end, and the setting up of the problem at the beginning of the introduction is very important. Setting the stage is very important, and you can't do that properly until you know what the action is going to be. So I suggest to most students that they wait and write the introduction right at the end, even after the conclusion. I mean, there are one or two things you know that you're going to put into an introduction. If it's a PhD in anthropology, for instance, you will put in something about the nature of your field work and the difficulties and strengths and weaknesses of it. You'll say something about the place that you worked and the background. You'll have to have a piece about previous theory in the field. This is required. And often people have right at the beginning something really gripping, just to catch attention, a particular strong story or event or something which immediately takes the reader in. So all that has to go there, and at the end of it, probably at the end of the first chapter, you'll have something outlining the rest of the thesis, but you write all this later on. Basically what you're doing in the first chapter is to set up the problem. Then in the middle of the actual body of the thesis, you're describing your solutions and your findings, and then at the end you have your conclusions. So that's one thing. The second main thing to stress, and I was never really told this, but I think it is very, very important. When I wrote my DPhil in history, and to a certain extent my PhD in anthropology, I took a very literal, linear view. I thought I should write it logically, starting with what I thought would be chapter 2, maybe not the introduction, chapter 3, chapter 4. And that was all right. But much better is what I learned later on in my writing, which is to start with what most interests you. Start with your best material. It's something you have in conversations. I often have something really exciting to tell to visitors or friends, and I used to put this off, thinking, well, I'll save it to later on. But in fact, if you say to start with that, it breaks the ice, warms you up, and then the conversation is much better. And it's the same with the thesis. Basically, work outwards. Find really the hub, what it was that really excited you when you were encountering it. Write about that. This has all sorts of effects. Firstly, you then work out from that to all sorts of new things. Your mind becomes a light. Secondly, you'll get confidence because you can see that you're writing something that's at least exciting to you. Writing a thesis is very like lighting a fire. If you were lighting a fire, what you do is you get a bit of very easily burnable substance like paper, and you just light that, and then you put a twig on top of it, and then you put bigger twigs and bigger twigs and bigger twigs like this, and the fire goes. If you get a great mass of wood and plonk it and try and light it, nothing will happen. So with starting a thesis, light the easily burnable, exciting bit first, and then place twigs on it, and it will expand and become really exciting for you, and your mind will become a light. If you don't do that, it will plod along, and you'll be grinding, thinking, oh, why am I writing this? I want to get on to something else, and it won't be as good.
Yeah, very interesting. And when you get your data ready in front of you, but you have no clear idea about what exactly to write, do you usually just sit down there trying to organize your thoughts before you actually move your pen, or is it the other way round?
Well, my own techniques have shifted. When I started as an insecure DPhil writer, I used to plan everything very, very carefully. I would take my notes and my data, break it into little bits, often onto little cards, arrange it on my desk, and then I would write a very detailed plan of what I was going to write. Each paragraph more or less planned out with a cross-reference to my data, and then I would try and integrate all this and write it. So I would spend a long time before I'd even start writing, and I would find lots of lovely quotations and so on. And it helps your self-confidence if you feel you're in control of your data and you know where you're going, and the whole chapter is mapped out carefully. And I did that for my DPhil and to a large extent for my PhD, and for my first couple of books were written like that. It's all right, and you may have to do it like that. Gradually, as you get confidence, it's rather like any art form. As a pianist, you have to start by following the music and thinking carefully before you do it. Gradually, as you get better and you become a real craftsman later on in your life, and you can start to practice it, you move to the other extreme, which is that you, of course, gather your data, you think about it, you have it all in your boxes and files, and then you put it on one side. And you find a very quiet place, and often, if you look at the writing methods of great philosophers, historians, anthropologists, you see pictures of them just sitting, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, just sitting with a board on his knee, writing, or Adam Smith, the economist, used to just sit in an easy chair, have a few books beside him, and write. De Tocqueville used to just sit in an armchair and write. They'd push their data aside, because the first thing you want to do, really, as an artist does, is to sketch out your ideas, just to let your mind quietly flow over things. So just think a little bit, but just write, whether it's typewriter or whatever, and then thicken it up with data. I think my early work was probably too data dense, and the result was that a lot of my bits of my books and my early writings were rather heavy and plodding, because I was working from the data up and then writing it out. You really want to work from the ideas to the data and back and forth like that. So I would suggest the best way, if you have the confidence, obviously, is to try both ways, but if you have the confidence, is to read through all that you want to read through, that you've collected, and then put it on one side. Maybe for 5 minutes sketch out a rough plan, point 1, 2, 3, and then start writing. And if you can't remember what's in your detailed notes or whatever, just write a note saying, I'll look at that later, or to be checked, or something like that. Leave gaps in it. And just write as quickly as you can, like that. And then the mind is not encumbered with too much material in the first draft. It's summed up in the small card that's kept on the typewriter, used to be kept on the typewriter of a famous writer who wrote Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury, and he had a little card which said, write first, think later. You can be overwhelmed by thinking and by data, and it's best to try and liberate yourself. Think of yourself more as a poet or a painter who's just sketching out. I mean, when John Keats or Shakespeare wrote a sonnet, they didn't sort of thumb through lots of books and so on. They had done all that, they'd thought of everything, and then they just wrote. That's what you can aim at. You may not be able to do it for a while, but that's gradually how your writing should develop.
So that type of writing is supposed to be very descriptive, but how to link that with theories? Because anthropological writing is supposed to be very theoretical and thought-provoking. So how to build up a theory, framework out of your own writing?
Well, you should have, already you should implicitly have a lot of theory. You've probably done an undergraduate course or a master's course, and you have a sort of rough background of theory. You know roughly the major points made by a number of theorists, and you've been reading and discussing these things. When you write, you don't need to think too consciously about that, but when you come to read it again, you'll see, oh well, this is relating to something that Durkheim said, or Victor Turner said, or something, and then you go and have a look at, and you enrich it and make it more theoretical. You can raise the level of theory after you've written the first draft, and you can raise the level of description. But if you don't let your mind follow its own paths, but keep stopping it with chunks of material, it'll be rather rough and not very convincing.
And many PhD students seem to complain that you have to stay lonely and isolated for months in order to write well. It sounds like an extended liminal phase of ambiguity in Rachel. And how do you think of this?
Well, I think there are two sides which are really captured by the phrase of a dear friend of mine who died, but he had a famous phrase, what is famous to me and a few friends. He described the creative act or creative work as a combination of boundedness and leakiness, that is, allowing things in. Bounded but leaky was his description of how we work. In order to really concentrate and to make an original and creative contribution, you do have to be alone. Certainly in the arts and humanities and social sciences, it's different in science probably, but even in science to a large extent, you have to look in on yourself and let your mind go. And therefore you need long periods, whether it's a long period each day or months at a time, of intense thinking, which no one really can share. The only person who can a tiny bit share it possibly is your supervisor when they read drafts of it. But even they will probably be out of their depth. I've interviewed a number of scientists who said that their supervisors really didn't understand what they were writing about, and I've had that feeling with some of my students. You roughly know, but you can't really follow it because you haven't been there and so on. So it is lonely intellectually. On the other hand, PhD, what you're referring to is the description of a PhD as an ordeal by loneliness. And it can be lonely, but it's very important that you counter that with deliberate strategies of leakiness. And those are more on the social side. That's to say, but also intellectual side. In our department we have quite a lot of mechanisms for helping PhD students return from the field to have a sort of social life. We have writing up seminars, we have seminars which students attend. There are lots of and they work together in a basement if they want to, and so on. So there's a lot of social interaction encouraged because of this knowledge that you are rather alone. If this isn't routinely done in your subject, then it's very helpful and important, and I did this when I was a PhD student, to find a group of people who are at the same stage as yourself and to form yourself into a kind of informal club. If it's just a matter of once or twice a week going out and having a drink together or coffee together, that's what you need. Or taking it in turns to talk about your work to each other. Or finding, if you can't find a whole group, finding one other person and doing an exchange with them, so that they read some of your stuff and you read some of their stuff, and so you've got just someone. In my case, I've been enormously unfortunate because I have my wife Sarah, who reads everything I write, and we share everything, we talk everything over. So I've never been lonely in my work because of that. But if you don't happen to have a partner or a very close friend who can act like that, try and create such a relationship. And on top of that, try and make sure that your social life and your hobbies and your artistic and other interests continue. You can't really work at writing. Writing is very intense, and you can't write, I think, for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. So that's 3 or 4 hours. You may want to spend 2 or 3 more hours a day reading or checking what you've written or going to a seminar. So between 4 and 8 hours a day is the maximum of work, of which only 3 hours is probably writing. You've got, if you sleep 8 hours, you've got another 8 hours. That's the time when you should be going to the cinema, you should be playing games, you should be going for walks, you should be seeing your friends, doing lots of things. And you shouldn't see this as dead time which is wasted. The more you can see your work and your life interlinked, in other words, when you're going for a walk, when you're watching a film, when you're watching television, when you're talking to your friends, suddenly, those are the times you'll probably have your good ideas. Your writing is when you pop them down, but I keep a little notebook with me all the time in my pocket, and which I used to call a great thoughts book. And on a bus trip, when I'm with my grandchildren, when I'm going to the cinema, when I'm doing particularly walking, ideas come, because what happens is you're writing away and then you're blocked or you can't see where to go. If you relax and have a good, reasonable social life, that will feed back. You will notice things, you'll suddenly see things. So keep reading novels, keep going to films, listen to music, do all the things you normally do in the other 8 hours. Don't overwork, don't try and write too much each day, just limit yourself. And then have the loneliness, which is the intellectual part of it, will be made much less threatening by having this cocoon around it of friends, activities and so on.
Yes, many Cambridge students complain that doing a PhD in Cambridge, PhD is permanent head damage, because in that they can never get rid of it, and even when they're going to the cinemas, having fun with friends, they still feel haunted by their writing up or other work.
That is a danger. It becomes obsessive. I mean, when Newton was asked how he just solved his problems, he said, by thinking on it all the time. And if you are in the middle of a very interesting piece of work, you are sort of half thinking about it. But that's another reason for taking a little notebook with you, because I found that if you have ideas when you're doing something else, if you have a notebook and write them down straight away, then you can forget about them.
Yes.
If you're in the middle of a party or watching a film and a good idea comes and you don't want to lose it, that spoils the rest of the film. So just let them come, write them down. Don't consciously spend your time thinking about your PhD. If possible, get yourself involved in something rather involving. I've noticed that a lot of very productive thinkers have some hobby, like the great mathematician G.H. Hardy of Trinity was an obsessive cricket fan. Every afternoon he used to go down to Fenners and watch the cricket, because mathematicians are notorious for thinking about mathematics all the time. But cricket took him out of it. If you've got something like cricket or music or something that really absorbs you, games often do, then you'll stop thinking about it.
Okay, good. If you write 3 hours per day, how many words do you usually produce within 3 hours?
Yes, I tend to write about 3 hours a day when I'm properly writing. I write, you have to choose the right time. It's very important to choose the right time, the right place for writing, and the right method. I work best about between 9 o'clock and 10 and 12 o'clock. So those 3 hours, perhaps 8:30 and then a break in the middle. So the mornings are when I write best, and some people write best at night and so on.
Yes.
If I write for 3 hours, I find that I've moved. Again, it's a matter of what you find best, the best way to write. I have got on my website an article which I wrote about how I write, which is called From Typewriter Through Computers to the Pen, because I started typing, and then I moved to computers, and now I write longhand. Whichever way I do it, I can obviously type faster than I can write, but I can write reasonably fast. Anyone with any of these methods in 3 hours can write at least 2,000 words. I can often write 4,000 words, even longhand, in the morning. I tell my PhD students, and they just laugh in disbelief. But I mean, basically, if you ration yourself to 5 days a week, because you should take some time off the weekends, and you write 2,000 words a day, that's 10,000 words. That is one chapter. So in 2 months you've written your thesis. Now obviously you don't. But I've written a number of my books in 2 months. Letters to Lily, even long books like Marriage and Love in England, which was 120,000 words, I wrote in 6 weeks.
Mm.
Because once you're writing very fast, you don't want to stop and you just write it. When I say writing, you write the first draft. Then you may spend another 6 months writing it again and again and again. But basically, you should be able to write 2,000 or 3,000 words a day. But you can't. No one can keep this up for very long. I find I can write 2,000 or 3,000 words a day for 5 days, and that's a chapter. Then I need 2 or 3 days rest, and then I can write another one like that.
Okay. And where do you think might be the best place to write? For example, in my case, I seem to have 3 options. I can write in the department where I got a workplace at basement, and I can write at the college library, or I can just write at home. And I haven't quite figured out where might be the best place for me to do my writing now yet. And how about you yourself?
Well, I found that I have different places. I like now, certainly, and I think I always have, for the first draft, which is the really, really important thing when you write the first bit, to have a place which is completely without any kind of distraction. Even someone moving around near me, let alone sounds and noise, distracts me. So I now write in a tea house which I have in my garden, looking out onto the garden. And if you look again at the working places of people who've written great books, for instance, Montesquieu used to write in a little, almost like a little prison. He had a whole chateau, and he could have written anywhere, but he found a little hole in the wall, which was a tiny little room, and he sat there without much distraction. If you look out onto a garden, it can be distracting. So basically, if you look at the writing places of most writers, they have a desk, a very quiet room like Darwin, and they shut the door. So writing in a basement in the department may be too distracting.
Yes.
You may need to kind of make things around you so you can't see anything, and you may need to wear earplugs so you can't hear anything. As long as you're not stimulated by sensory signals from outside, that's probably all right. But you need an uninterrupted place. You need a comfortable chair.
Yes.
I used to write sitting with a computer, and it was very stiff and formal like this. I now find a comfortable chair like this, and I put my writing on my knee, and I handwrite. You need to feel comfortable, and nearly all the great writers who I've studied had armchairs, and they just wrote in their armchairs. Other people had different methods. One of the greatest stylists in the English language, the historian Maitland, used to write standing up at a lectern.
That's very unusual.
And he used to speak aloud as he wrote. So he wrote it as if he was talking to an audience. And this gave his writing a great simplicity, because it was explaining to someone sitting in front of him something. So it has the feeling of spoken word, which is much simpler and clearer. So it may, what you want to do is to try different things, but above all, one is advised to find somewhere which is associated with writing. In other words, find a place where you're comfortable to write. Don't do other things there, just write there.
Okay.
And for instance, the great danger nowadays is email, because there's nothing as tantalizing as writing on your computer. Some people, of course, are foolish enough to turn on the email alert so that they keep being bombarded, or just to check your emails, because writing is very hard work, and people, they don't want to write. Even if you enjoy it, you think, oh, I'll just check my emails. That way madness lies.
How does your first draft usually look like, and how many times do you have to rewrite it?
I found even from the days when I used to do it with a typewriter, always there have been a number of drafts. The first draft looks, well, nowadays doing it by hand, the first draft looks handwritten, which is a good thing, because if you do it on a computer, your first draft looks rather good. You print it out and you think, oh, that looks quite neat. It is neat. And if you've got the spell check on, which is a disaster too, because you spend your time wondering about spelling, but you know, it comes out looking rather neat. In the old days, the great thing was that you typed it out and then you changed it by pen. That was the only way you could do it without a computer. And then you retyped it. I think, on average, looking at all my PhDs and DPhils, I probably rewrote about 4 times. And nowadays, because it's much easier, I write it by hand first time, type it in second time, and then do it perhaps another 2 or 3 times. So, and here I agree with Lafcadio O'Hearn, who had some very wise thoughts on this subject, which we may get round to. And he wrote just off the top of his head once, and then he revised it about 3 or 4 times. I think probably reading through it and changing it about 3 or 4 times, each time improving it, is about a reasonable level.
Yes. You have written many books and articles. And which article or book do you find most satisfactory to you, and why is that?
You tend, of course, always to like the last book you wrote, if you're lucky, because it's the one you remember and you're still involved with. The most important book I wrote, probably, was the first book I wrote by this new method, before I'd written 2 PhDs and published 3 books, one on my fieldwork and witchcraft and another. And then I wrote one in 6 weeks called The Origins of English Individualism. And this was, for me, a complete transformation, both in my writing style and in my philosophy of life and history. A very short book, which challenged the whole theoretical paradigm in historical sociology, and it had a huge impact, and it's the book I'll probably be best known for, and it's just being translated and published in China. Yeah. That I loved writing, and it was theoretically my most important book. The book I'm personally and emotionally fondest of is my Letters to my granddaughter, Letters to Lily, because it's about a relationship I have with someone I love, my granddaughter, and it synthesized and summarized all that I had discovered about the world and how the world works in my first 60 years or so. And so it encapsulates. It's also the book that's been translated into most languages, about 12 different languages, and was one of the best-selling of my books. And I think people who read it find it the most affecting book. I meet people who say they've been in tears reading it. I met one the other day. So those are my 2, I think.
Yeah, congratulations, because I also heard very positive and good feedbacks and comments on those 2 books, no matter in England or in China. Yes, and have you found that your writing style changed over the past 30 or 40 years of your teaching and writing career?
Yes, it has. I mean, I've implied this a number of times. I started with what might be considered a very logical and positivistic. I thought that what you did was that you formulated a question, then you examined all the data and worked up from the data, an empirical system. So you'd have your data spread out, and then you would basically summarize what you consciously knew and synthesize it and present it. And that was how my first 4 or 5 works, and it continued to a certain extent in some of the later, longer books on political theory. You have to do that sometimes because another thing I should mention is that your best writing is really done when you are fresh to a subject. Many people think that if they work at a subject more and more, they are going to learn more and more, and their writing is going to get better and better. But writing goes in a kind of curve. There's a period when you don't know anything and your writing isn't going to be very good. There's a period when you know just the right amount and you're learning about the subject. Writing should be really a way of talking to yourself, explaining to yourself what you know and what you don't know. So at this point it's fresh, you're filled with surprise, and you're revealing to yourself and to your reader what you know.
Yes.
After that, further work goes into the law of diminishing marginal returns. You work harder and it gets stale. There's new material constantly coming in, where ideas are, you can't remember what you really thought at the beginning. So I find that my best writing is done rather like lecturing. It's just the same as lecturing. Your first year of lecturing isn't usually very good. Second year is pretty good. The third year is really the best. And the fourth, fifth, it begins to tail off. And so basically you write when you are just the point where your knowledge is quite considerable, but you don't know everything, and you're learning new things. And so gradually I've moved from a view of writing as being summarizing what I already knew and writing it down, to thinking of writing as a form of research, as a creative activity, where your mind is actually thinking and you are finding out new things in the writing. I think the mistake I made, and many people make, is that you think of writing as a kind of like writing a report on something you already know, whereas writing, which is using complex aspects of your brain which connects different things, is actually a creative exploration. I often say to students, you do your field work for the first time in the field, and then you do it again in your mind. The Remembered, the title of the book by Srinivas, The Remembered Village. You remember, and then you make connections which you couldn't have made in the field. And those connections are made in the writing, because the strange thing about writing, if you're doing it well, is that you don't really know what you're going to write. I mean, I'm at an extreme, but sometimes my wife Sarah says to me at the end of the day, you know, what did you write today? And I say, I don't know. I'll only know tomorrow when I read it.
Yes.
You go into a kind of automatic state. It's such a difficult thing, and you're such a high level of concentration that you don't consciously think about it. It's very similar. Imagine if you're a very good pianist. You can't think about reading the music and translating it and where your finger should be there and there. It just comes in one action.
Yes.
As a sports player, you don't think about the parts, you just do it. So finally, if you become a really good writer, your whole body and your mind become an instrument over which you only have partial conscious control. A lot of it is done almost automatically. This is why often when you're writing your best work, you feel as if some force, as Kipling said, his demon, is writing through you.
Yes.
You feel, if you were in a shamanic culture, you'd feel, you know, that the spirits were coming down into you and writing. Now, the sign of my early writing, my first PhDs, was that I hardly ever felt that. I just felt grinding along, writing and writing and writing.
Yes.
Recently, my last 3 or 4 books have moved to a phase where I feel liberated. The writing is part of the thinking and the research. And that's a very wonderful phase. In many ways, as many artists have said, the moment of artistic creation is the highest point in your life. When a mathematician or a painter, musician is creating, that moment they remember all their life. The moment when I was writing Individualism or Lily or the chapters on Tocqueville or whatever were moments that I'll remember all my life, because I suddenly felt as if the whole world had come together and that some force was going through me. It's rather like a religious ecstasy.
Yes.
that poets feel. Now,
Yes.
you probably won't feel this for your first PhD, but
No.
it's something to just think about, a possibility of moving towards that. Okay?
Yes. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And since you have been written on different topics such as witchcraft, individualism, marriage, modernity, and you've been writing about different cultures such as Nepal, Japan, and China. So, what do you think most important that leads up all the way to this kind of magic stage where you can write freely, you can use your wisdom and mind and your hand that make them work so coherently and together to produce such wonderful piece of writing?
Whether it's wonderful, of course, is another question.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of things.
Yeah.
There's nothing like success to breed success. In other words, if you've done some good writing and you've published a little bit, it gets easier and easier. Again, something that happens to people is that they do a little bit of writing, they do their PhD, maybe publish a book, and then they wait another 5 or 10 years, and it gets more and more difficult. Writing is like many things. It's like running. You know, if you run a good race, you don't then stop for 5 years until you run another race. You keep running. It doesn't. You may say, well, who's going to publish all this stuff? It doesn't matter. I write a lot of my things, and I've got a number of unpublished books. I write them for myself because I enjoy. Nowadays, of course, with the internet, you put them up on your blog, or you have a website with your writings on. So you can write for a small audience if you want to. But keep writing. Don't, after you've published a book or an article, and think, well, I've used up my energy, I'm not going to do anything more. So the more you do, and also each time try a slightly different style or approach. It's very tempting if you've had a successful book or a successful article to do the same thing, try and do the same thing again. But really, I nearly always fall into that trap, and I show it to my wife and she says, Alan, this is just the same letters to Lily over again, you must try something different, and she's right. It's easier to go into the same thing, but you should try something different. And you should try something different not only in its style and format, but you should try something very far away from what you've just done. It's also a great temptation if you've carved out a little territory, if you've written a book on witchcraft, then to write a book on magic, and then to write a book on... After I wrote on witchcraft, I wrote about crime and violence. After that, I wrote about marriage. After that, I wrote about political philosophy or demography. Change direction a lot. And also, you mentioned places. I mean, if you've written about Japan, don't go on writing about Japan for a bit. Write about China or something else. Because the freshness, if you cover the subject well, your best thoughts on that will be used. You want to look. I learnt a lot of this from my former professor and advisor and help and mentor, Jack Goody, because I noticed that he's a very prolific and very creative writer, and he's published about 25 books now, and they're very, very different on all sorts of subjects. But Jack's books also point to something else which is you half-asked, which is that while you keep going on to different subjects, there should be some theme or strand that connects them. If you just think, oh well, what shall I do next, that's an interesting subject, it may not really work. All my writing, in a sense, has been trying to answer a few simple questions, coming from my childhood and my own experience. Basically, the question is very simple. Why are we here? Who are we? What are human beings?
Yeah, they're very fundamental questions.
Yeah, they're just the deepest questions about the nature of human beings, the nature of our world, the nature of historical development to get to our world. So I'm trying to understand those philosophical questions, or try answers to them, quite bordering on religion, but not religion, bordering on philosophy, but not philosophy, but pursued through history and anthropology. And so each of my books is really, I'm sitting here looking through different windows. I look through this window at glass, and I find the history of glass tells me something about how perception and the Renaissance occurred. And I look through tea, and I find out how our medical revolution and how the modern world emerged from the Malthusian trap. I look through this. So they appear to be entirely different, but they come back to some fairly fundamental, simple questions, which I started asking at school when I was about 14 or 15, and have gone on asking. I mean, clearly there's no likeness between me and Einstein, but Einstein said the same thing. He asked childlike questions when he was a child, and people said, well, you can't answer those till you grow up. When people grew up, they stopped asking the questions, and he went on asking those questions. Yeah. And that's what I've gone on asking. And all my books are really in pursuit of answers to those very childlike questions.
Yes, you're very modest. And as far as I know, all your books try to answer very fundamental questions, to see the world through a piece of grain. So really provide very good perspective to look at the world. And you have been interviewing people like those intelligent people of remarkable mind. Do you find it informative to you as a writer?
That's a good question, because I've always thought that another way of improving how you both do research and write and solve problems would be to study the lives and works of people who have been successful in doing this. So I do this in two ways. Firstly, I've written a number of books about the lives and works of people I really admire, like Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Tocqueville, Weber, and so on, to see how they worked, what their lives were, what led to their creativity, what their working methods were. So I do it through the study of dead people, the greatest. I look at their notebooks, I look at their letters, and so on, and learn an enormous amount from, say, studying de Tocqueville's working methods or Maitland's working methods. The other thing is to do it through talking to people who you admire. So 20 years ago, or a bit more, I started interviewing great anthropologists. I thought, well, if I could learn something from the generation above me who were great anthropologists, then I could apply it in my own work. I could read their works, but often they don't tell you much about who they are or how they work or their lives. And that started off in a modest way and then has increased, and now I've done about 120 interviews, many of them for 2 or 3 hours, well, 2 hours. And what I found is that there were a lot of anthropologists, something like 60, but another 60 or more non-anthropologists. Yeah. About 11 Nobel Prize winners, including the only double Nobel Prize winner in the world. And when you talk to a great cosmologist like Sir Martin Rees, Lord Rees, or molecular biologists or mathematicians or chemists, you find that they really think and work in quite similar ways. Their object of attention is different, but their thinking patterns overlap with what I've learned. But you learn little tricks from them, and you learn what doesn't work and what does work, because a lot of learning the craft of writing is to learn what works. It's like being a great composer like Handel or Bach. What you see is that in their early works they're trying out all sorts of things. Gradually they find out this works. If you're going to have a death scene, then use this kind of instrument, because you tried it in an earlier case, it worked, try it again. And when you're writing, gradually you build up a repertoire of things that work and don't work. You learn those skills. And a shortcut to doing that is to talk to as many people who you think have been successful, and be very honest and direct as you are doing, and say, well, how do you do it? Yes. And they usually like talking about it, as you can see.
Good. You're currently writing a book on Cambridge. And may I have the opportunity to ask about how this book is going on, your writing up? Yeah.
Well, it's exactly similar to what I've been saying. That is, I started writing it in China, and that's another tip, that often it's best to start writing things well away from what you're writing about, if you're close to it. So I started writing it. I started writing it really to help my friends and students like yourself, because they came to China, to Cambridge, which is very confusing and very old and complicated, and they were often puzzled by it. So I thought, as I've been here a long time, why don't I write down what I know about it, which might be helpful. And to begin with, I just wrote straight off the top of my head. I chose the letter C for Cambridge, and I wrote about lots of subjects under the letter C. So I wrote under clubs, or committees, or cabals, or carols, or whatever it was, everything I could think about.
Colleges,
everything with C, cam, and charm, and customs, and culture. So I had lots of little vignettes off the top of my head. Then I discussed it with Sarah, and she said that's all right for the first draft, but it doesn't really work as a book. So I then consolidated them into chapters, and it was, at the moment it's at the stage where a lot of the ideas are there, but the detailed research, which I need to justify things because some things are wrong, is now going on. I'm going back into archives, I'm reading further books, I'm talking to people, I'm getting comments back from friends and colleagues, and I'm trying it out. This is another thing which is worth stressing. I mentioned that you should perhaps find someone else who's interested in swapping with your writing. I found it, and this came from studying Adam Smith and Tocqueville, they had all their stuff read by ordinary people, by their brothers, by non-specialists. So I get non-specialists, if possible, to read my stuff, to see whether the style is right as well as the content. But in the case of Cambridge, since everyone's Cambridge is different, I got it right from the top. The Vice-Chancellor's reading it, the head of, the ex-head of New Hall is reading it, the Librarian of Kings has read a bit, and colleagues near the top have read it, but I'm getting PhD students and maybe undergraduates to read it as well, just so that I get different slants on it, and they will say, well, this works, this doesn't work, I don't understand that, you've forgotten that. And then gradually it gets firmed down. So it's coming on well. I've got a first draft, and whether it'll be a book, whether it'll be a blog, whether it'll be a website, who knows.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And are there any other things you'd like to share with us in terms of writing?
I think just the main thing to stress overall is that writing should be fun. You find it's a burden. I mean, it's always an effort. So you think, oh, I don't want to write today. But an effort and a burden is a different thing. It should be something you look forward to. You should even have to ration. You know, I must stop now. If it becomes just a dreary kind of effort to get through it, then there's something wrong in the way you're doing it. You're either getting too tired, or you're thinking about it too much. That's one last tip, which came out in an interview too, which is that it's very difficult to start writing. It's difficult at the beginning of a day, it's the beginning of a chapter. It's a very good idea never to completely finish off a bit of writing. So if it comes, you've been writing away and you're 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through a chapter on a Friday evening, don't make a big effort and finish the chapter. Just at the end of a Friday, or whenever you're going to have a little break, if you're going on a holiday or something, just leave it 9/10 finished. Write down a few notes of what you would have gone on to write if you'd spent another 2 hours or another day on it. Leave yourself notes saying, and then I'll talk about this, and then I'll talk about that. Then when you come back on the Monday or after a holiday, or you just look at your notes and you read through the last 3 or 4 pages, and you just go on easily from that, and you write out what you would have written. Then you're warmed up, and it's the middle of the day, and then you type in chapter 4, and then you start off. If you have a blank screen or a blank sheet of paper saying chapter 4 on a Monday morning, hopeless. Okay?
So how soon does a student know what the thesis is about?
Well, that's one of the strange things, because you really never know what the thesis is about until right at the end. Much of the writing of the thesis is actually trying to find out what the question is. So people are often worried. They're halfway through their thesis and they come and say to me, I don't know what I'm writing about, I don't know where it's going. And I say, well, that often happens. It's really just as you come towards the end. It's like a journey or an exploration, and it's only when you get near the end of the journey that you know what you found. So don't worry about it, just keep journeying, and it almost always works out that at the end you know where you're going.
So should a student keep a diary of writing?
It's very difficult to know when you're writing exactly where you are, what you have done and what you are about to do. So it's a good idea to keep a kind of, not necessarily a diary every day, but a sort of book, which I call a sort of a great thoughts book or something like that, just to give me encouragement. But it basically, every 2 or 3 months I stop and I spend an hour or two and I write down exactly what I've been doing and what I think I'm going to do, at a sort of planning meeting with myself. This gives an overview and you get things into perspective, and then you know exactly where the next part of the journey is going to be. And it's also extremely interesting after you finish the book to look back over it and to see how you thought you were going to do this and then you did something else. But it's a good idea to keep, not just for writing, but generally in your whole academic life, a book over the years. I started one rather late in my life. I wished I'd done it earlier, right at the beginning, but I started in my 30s, and I found it a fascinating sort of thing to look back on and very helpful for sorting out my ideas.
How worried should a student be about the number of words?
As I mentioned right at the beginning of the interview, a thesis is usually restricted, usually 80,000 words, and people, particularly with word counts on their computers now, know exactly how many words they've done, and they start thinking, oh dear, I've written another chapter, long chapter, and they start shortening things. I think you should never worry about the words at all until near the end. You should never write short. You should never think, oh well, this chapter's getting too long, I better just cut out bits as I think about it. Just write exactly what you want to write and then cut it later. Nearly always, and this again worries students, they come to me and say, oh, my thesis is 120,000 words and I'm only allowed 80,000 words or 100,000 words. Almost all books and all theses are at least a third too long. They should be like that because there's always some repetition and unnecessary writing, and it's always better to have too much than to cut it down. So don't think about word lengths, just write as you want to write and then prune it later. And I would like to thank my 2 interviewers, Jialing Luo and Lily B, for helping me with this interview. Thank you very much.